going to the food justice panel or discussion. We've sort of, I think we're taking the word climate out of it, just because there's so much that we can talk about with just food justice, and I'm sure lots of threads will come in that are related to climate. So for those who are like really dying to talk about climate justice, you know, we'll definitely touch on that. You all know me. This is Colin Dring. This is Ian Marcuse. They're both amazing activists and knowledgeable people in the local and global food systems. I'll let them introduce themselves, if that makes sense, if that's okay. And I'll just quickly sort of start off. I'm just going to say kind of a few words, and then I really want to spend time with these two really amazing people and let them share, and then hopefully we can have a really interesting dialogue as well about food systems and food systems change. So we just had lunch, so you know, obviously we all appreciate food, interact with food. It's one of the most sort of visceral, Colin is just saying, sort of things that we are intimate systems that we engage with. And so food is integral to everything that we do. And that can also be emblematic of how we build our communities, interact with each other, and act politically. Like, it's got lots of things that are tied up in it with food systems. I was reflecting the other day when Dan was talking about your first talk about sort of social ecology, and talking about the difference between environmentalism and social ecology, and how environmentalists would put the scrubbers on the top of the smokestack and say, we're done. Whereas social ecologists really look at the whole system and go, okay, wait a minute, what's the whole problem here? And I think it's very similar with the food system. You know, we can say more organic farms, or, you know, grow local or eat local, and it's like, okay, that's just like the scrubber on top of the smokestack. That's not the whole system. So I thought that was a good kind of analogy. And so these are sort of ways that the food systems work that we're doing, and that many, many people are doing now, is connected to social ecological kind of views. So I just want to throw it out there, like, what do we think of when we talk about food systems? What do people think of?
Farming.
Farming, yeah.
Monocropping.
Mm-hmm. Transportation, yeah.
Farm workers.
Yeah.
I think like capitalist organization of these structures.
Yeah. Thank you.
Like chemical companies.
Chemical companies, yeah. Yeah. Seeds.
Yeah. Now pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? That's
Yeah.
the big one.
Cargill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Soil microbiology.
Pardon?
Soil microbiology.
Yeah.
Classist foodies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you kind of like jumped a step there from production to consumption. What's arising in between? Transportation, yeah.
Markets.
Distribution channels, yeah. You got this lovely packaging, right? Whole subsidiary industries devoted to containers. Processing, yeah, fantastic. From the simple to the complex, like just chopping through to, you know, those McCain pizza pops that are like 40 ingredients from all over. Yeah.
The global is something I was thinking, it's like the food system is global.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I believe they call it molecular gastronomy now. That's the high-end chemistry.
Foodieism.
Yeah.
Now we have freedom molecules. Also known as
You can't eat those.
oil.
Contacting some of those guys from the wine magazines when you're in Canada.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Think of waste.
Exactly, yeah, for sure.
Pardon?
Waste.
Waste, yeah. Yeah.
Compost.
Yeah, what happens post-consumption, both to the organic materials and the inorganic materials.
Well, like seasons.
Yeah,
Seasons? Yeah.
Processed food.
yeah, for sure.
Just cooking.
Yeah,
ourselves. We're all part of it.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
About community, or
Industrial
family.
farmland. Yep.
Like food deserts?
Food deserts.
Culture.
Yeah.
So it's rich, like, and it's covering like huge gamuts of, you know, of topics and expansive areas. So when we're working in food systems, we're trying to like think of all of these things. And so it is a complex kind of web of how it's all joined together. You have Ian here who has been working for 30 years. Oh, let's say 30 years, or a long time, like in the local food systems level. So we're going to hear from Ian. a
Well,
bit.
10 years in the food systems, but yeah, many years doing environmental work,
Right.
community organizing.
Awesome. And then Paula will take on maybe some of the more bigger picture things. So that's sort of roughly how it's structured, but you know, we're hoping we'll have a dialogue and engage everyone here in this what you guys are talking about now. So, should I turn it over to you, Ian?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, jump in, like, totally. I don't think Colin nor I, or Claire want to dominate and talk too much, but just real briefly, a little bit about myself. I was born in Vancouver, and but I grew up in Calgary, came back in Vancouver in '86, and spent most of my adult life doing environmental organizing and ran an environmental group for years, mainly focusing on old growth logging, conservation of old growth. Did a lot of work with Indigenous communities, particularly those communities engaged or who are more sovereigntist in orientation. And actually got kind of burned out of all that work and did a bunch of co-op building for a number of years, so like the co-op just next door here. Found it really creative and connecting and sort of a positive outlet for my anger and my frustration with the system. And then I started doing food work about 10 years ago. Yeah, so you know, one of the things that I learned as an environmental activist, you know, trying to fight the corporation, was how frustrating it is, and really the importance of relationship building, and you know, knowing that until we build relations with, you know, forest workers and Indigenous communities, we're not going to win this battle. We really need to learn to be better allies, and learn to work with these other communities. So, but that's hard work, and there were some visionaries around at the time who kind of were putting more of their energy into working with forestry workers, which was kind of cool work, bringing labor into the environmental sort of work. And but I gravitated to co-op building because I saw it as sort of something more creative and interesting and fun. Just had enough of the battle. But one thing I really came to sort of understand was the importance of relationship building. And so a thing about food is I really, you know, love that area of this kind of work, in that, you know, it's all about relations, and I think food has the capability of really building relations. You know, we go on picnics with our friends, we go to restaurants, we have potluck dinners, and so on and so on and so on. So many relationships are mediated around food and whatnot, and then sort of taking it a step further, you know, if we're not in right relationship with our community and with other sectors, we're not really, you know, it's going to be harder to build the movement that we want to build. And I just think food has just that great potential in bringing people together. So, you know, so I'm all about the process and relationship building over, as you're saying, the scrubbers in the, you know, we can save that forest, or we can, you know, that stream, but ultimately, you know, if we're warring between ourselves, you know, one thing about breaking bread together, and you know, I'm not Christian, but you know, I appreciate sort of some of the meaning behind that word, and a lot of the meaning is about forgiveness and building understanding between difference and making peace with your enemies by sharing food together. There's no doubt you sit at a table with someone you don't know, you're an immediate friend. Right? So food has that power. Absolutely. So, you know, and I think fundamental to ecological wellness and human wellness is the wellness of our relations. And then we can explore a little bit further, I think, in terms of decolonization, what this term relations means, not only to each other as human beings, but also to the land. You know, working with Indigenous communities over the years, and more recently through the BC Food Systems Network and the Indigenous working group on BC Systems Working Group on Indigenous Sovereignty, if I have it right. People like Don Morrison, who some of you may know, who's Secwepemc activist and food systems leader, has really taught me a lot too about what is our relationship to the land and the importance of that relationship. And place-based context and understanding that relationship between the land and social systems, and community norms and values and policy and political context. It's all in relation. So I owe a lot of my thinking to Indigenous worldviews and perspectives. So my work, I work for a neighborhood food network in Vancouver. And how many of you are from Vancouver? So, oh, cool. Where do you live in Vancouver?
Kerrisdale.
Kerrisdale. So I live in the East Van on Commercial Drive. So only one person from Vancouver. So Vancouver has a unique model, a very decentralized, grassroots, called Vancouver Neighbourhood Food Networks, but very rich city of lots of rich sort of urban agriculture movement, farmers markets, and then we have like community food organizations like my organization, Grandview Woodland Food Connection. I work in East Vancouver, and we have 15 of these networks that are community-based, they're neighborhood-based within designated city boundaries. We work out of either neighborhood houses or community centers, so we're very embedded in community and where we can leverage all that amazing community resource and capital. We focus on anti-poverty, vulnerability. We're one coordinator, terribly underfunded, doing a huge pile of work, but it's an interesting model. I don't know of any other city in North America that has this kind of neighborhood food network structure that's partially funded through our health authority with a small amount of funding, and the city social policy. But there's problems with that too. But it does sustain this grassroots group, and we work together very closely. We collaborate, whether it's funding proposals or initiatives. I like the model. I mean, it has its downside, of course, but that's what we do. And the focus is primarily on food access, food skills, more community development orientation than, say, community organizing. We just, that's the problem. We need to be doing more of that community organizing work to do the political work, but we're hamstrung by just the crisis we're facing, a lot of poverty, and in my community, 1 in 5, 20% of people are food insecure, large Indigenous community that are struggling, and so on and so on. And so we're just kind of barely keeping up with people's basic needs. And I think at a personal individual level, we're seeing some positive change, people feeling more empowered, understanding the system better, taking control of their own lives, getting involved in community gardens and other social things. And a lot of our focus is on social engagement, skill building, that kind of work. Bulk buy programs, sort of cooperative buying stuff, food skills, a lot of school gardening work, which kind of gets to some of that land-based learning, connecting to the land. We're doing more and more of that. Food workshops, a lot of celebrations, events, special things like that. So that's a lot of the focus of our work. I would like to call myself more of a community organizer. I'd like to be doing more of that political work. We're just not quite there. So we have, there's big issues up for us. Equity issues big, and we'll talk about that. Decolonization in BC, as you know, this is all unceded land, which is very unique. We are on stolen, we are occupiers on this stolen land, so it falls on us to understand what are our responsibilities to the Coast Salish people on whose land we're on. And I don't think we understand that very well. Certainly one of our responsibilities is taking care of the land, but there's protocols and there's laws that we have very little understanding of. And that's kind of this conversation has started to enter into our discussion here in Vancouver, in BC, in a much bigger way, just in the past couple of years, thanks to people like Don Morrison. And that's really exciting work, and it's hopeful for me because it's giving us a new sense of the role of an alternative food economy, an alternative food system that's really based on a place-based connection to the land. So I'm going to leave it at that because there's so much more to say. But thank you for listening. Colin, tear it apart.
So, my name's Colin Ring. I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of British Columbia, which I think means something for those who think that means something. I've spent a lot of time in academia, so I've grown quite comfortable critiquing academia. And I also spent some time in a similar role to Ian's, but I was working more at a municipal scale for the city of Richmond. So I ran a food security, anti-hunger organization, sustainable ag organization just south in the city of Richmond for about 4 years. We did a lot of similar things. We saw a lot that there was this kind of movement among people who really cared about food, who cared about the environment. They saw this obvious marriage there, that agricultural systems, food systems themselves were inherently like environmentally deleterious. We saw that in the 60s with Rachel Carson's seminal work around Silent Spring. And I think like we've seen this kind of dual pickup of food on both the environmental radar and then the charitable radar. And so in my experience, and these are very broad strokes, right? There are definitely counter examples and exceptions. Both of those movements suffered from expert syndrome, where you have a well-intentioned white colonial body telling someone else what they should do. And so for me, like when I stepped into the environmental world, I found that like deeply disturbing and displeasing almost immediately. First, I have a real problem with authority, and secondly, I don't like to be told what to do. So this was not going to work well. And I immediately picked up on this liberal notion that was also very top-down. Like, if I taught you about the problems with containers, you would never use them, right? Like, education became this logical pathway to behavior change, and then we would just magically aggregate this across whole communities and populations, and this would be like our reality. We'd get rid of containers. We'd get rid of pesticides. But these, like, that's not the reality. It's very rare that individual behavior change through person-to-person interactions leads to any systemic change. Very rare. In fact, I almost draw a blank on identifying one. And so this change strategy of being embedded in liberal notions, in colonial notions, in Western notions, centering these ideologies was really problematic for me. And then I saw food. And so these pieces that Ian has kind of pointed to, these gathering places, this kind of like releasing of the guilt and the shame aspects that I was experiencing in the environmental work, where you would break bread with someone or you would share a cultural dish with someone, it would have story and it would have meaning, it would have feeling, and it wasn't about just telling. It wasn't about, you know, it wasn't just about like, you know, your food practices are garbage. I mean, subsequently it came to be like that, right? And as any like well-intentioned group of people start to identify alternatives, these othering processes happen, right? And so I study agricultural planning, I study food system planning, I come from an environmental climate change planning background, and I was really starting to see, and I'll use this example here locally of shark fin soup. Is anyone familiar with shark fin soup?
Yeah.
Okay, so shark fin soup is, it's basically like, it's a Chinese dish. It has high cultural significance. It's usually a celebratory dish. Usually served at like weddings, that kind of like high level thing. But the practice for shark fin is, it's pretty atrocious. Like, you find a shark, you cut off its fin, and then you toss it, and you keep the fin, right? The shark subsequently dies. Through the through the harvest of shark fin, like hundreds of thousands of sharks are dying per year. So, who is going to rescue the sharks from this impending human dilemma? Well, the environmentalists, the conservationists. So hordes of white people came into places like Richmond and began telling Chinese people how to eat. They began telling them what their food practice should be. They began shaming them about their food practices, right? So imagine like your own cultural food practices and someone coming up to you, someone who's not from your culture, telling you, you can't eat pig anymore, you're a horrible person for eating pig. You should go shoot yourself for eating pig. Like, this was the level of animosity. And not only that, it was now occupying racial terrain, right? So Chinese people in this context were subject to head tax, they were separated from their families, they weren't allowed to work, they were vilified, yellow peril was a thing, right? And so this is kind of the context in which there's like a lived memory of people who still experienced marginalization, and now their food practices are now under question. Okay, so I want you to hold that. Simultaneously, a group called Shark Truth pops on the scene. And Shark Truth is a group of Chinese descent folks from all over the world here in Canada who have a deep love of the environment and of sustainability. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to work with restaurants. They wanted to work with the Chinese community as Chinese people themselves, Chinese descent people themselves, to shape this cultural practice. To push back and say like, yeah, we totally acknowledge the important cultural significance of this food, but the practice of consuming shark fin itself is outdated and we don't need to do this. We need to move, like our culture needs to move with the times. And so they were doing this deep relational work with restaurateurs, with suppliers, and they were making strides. They were doing really well. Until the white conservationists came back in and really blew this thing into like a race war. And I tell you this story because it's not an uncommon story. It's not uncommon for us, so if you're from the States, a lot of African American people live in spatially segregated communities. Food deserts, as someone mentioned, is more likely to occur in African American or Latinx populations. We know that these things are still arising on racial lines, and yet our movement work says, let's just build a community garden. Let's create another food co-op or a farmer's market, right? But farmers markets are a price point for elite middle upper class people. So many of our interventions are now falling under this critique. They're falling under the liberal critique of it being too individualistic, which subsequently then gets into the material or consumer critique, which is, can you vote with your dollar? Is that a thing? I disagree. I don't think that you can actually vote with your dollar. I think the system is set up that all of your votes go to the big names. So it's kind of like a fixed game of like pseudo-democracy. And then you have these new questions that are challenging even our notions of the state. So when we look at like who might make systemic change, usually we think nation states, large governments, or multiple scales of government, municipal through to federal. We also recognize that those mechanisms are complicit because the democratizing forms that we use are still reliant on those same old ideologies of liberalism, of individualization. And so like this relational piece I think that Ian is talking to is now starting to like bubble up. But fundamental, in my opinion, of this relational work is that it challenges the ideologies of individualism, of liberalism. I'm not saying that we like have a return here to communism or socialism. I think these are just
We
like,
are.
So I am saying that we should be reinvigorating forms of communism.
Small c communism.
Small c communism, socialism. I mean, much of my readings of like, so my theoretical work draws on like Zizek and Rancière and Mouffe, these folks who are basically like, as you know, are pro-political, right? And so for me, a lot of the work now is about re-politicizing that work, is about recentering the ability of people to organize and to be responsible to those relationships, right? So I don't want to go too deep into that because I think at some point it becomes ranty and rambly, but I do want to throw it out to folks. Like, I think like what's much more interesting for us is to have a conversation. Are there things that we've thrown out there that are terminological sticking points? Like, because I think like in the food world we have some jargon, which is fair. Are there things that you want expansion on? Are there things that you're working on, or where food connects with you that we can have a conversation with?
Yeah, Peter.
It's not really a terminological question, but can you say a little bit more about how much in today's food justice circles, how much of that critique that Colin just outlined of the notion of individual consumption choices being the driver of change, how widespread is that more critical and more systematic approach?
Yeah, so I'll start, I think, firmly from Indigenous food sovereignty is where the critique comes loudest, because the counter-hegemony of an ideology that's still intact exists, right? So for those on the other side of like mostly marginalized groups, I would say, who are working in food justice problematically has been very picky choosy about the theoretical origins of justice that it wants to draw on. So in one breath, you'll have them quoting like Rawls and Adams, and in the next breath, they'll go like radical communist on you. And you're like, those ideas are, no. Like, you can't have a market-based economy and then have like radical reform of like deep democracy. Like, those things don't, and like, so we've seen that kind of like discursive fumbling almost. And then we've also seen the critique that comes out, which is, you know, like, your community gardens are super white, or your food banks are not democratic at all, and you shouldn't have control over 40,000 people's food with an executive director in a C-suite. That's kind of crazy, right? Those critiques will come out, and then they'll just kind of appropriate some of that food justice language, and they'll say, well, like, in our strategic plan, we've got equity, so therefore our food skill workshop towards this immigrant population shows you how food justice we are, right? And so there's just kind of been this like critique, and then a like kind of surface recognition, and then just a reversion back to practice, and then claiming that practice as justice practice. And so what we've been really thankful for is a lot of the American scholarship has been saying, no. You don't get to just like take your shitty food programs that perpetuate inequity, listen to some like BIPOC person or person of color like give you a talk, and then say now that your programs are equity programs, right? So that's been something that I think like we're all just kind of struggling with right now, is like both the calling out, and then also trying to figure out like what does an anti-oppressive or a decolonizing practice look like?
Yeah, I think food justice is terribly misunderstood and overused and appropriated by a lot of people that aren't doing food justice. So yeah, I mean it's a much deeper, more complex term and understanding, and you know, I think it's what we all want to be doing much more of, and that's that anti-oppression work. But it's, you know, looking at the social relations, the economic relations that are more just and sustainable. And I think we're starting to have that conversation, but we're still pretty late in the game, I would say. I mean, we have a program that's kind of, you know, cooperative sort of type of exchange where we're you know, we're working together to pool our money, to buy directly from the wholesaler, and in some cases directly from the farmer. So, you know, we're able to pay the farmer a decent wage, so that's good. We're able to distribute food that's a little bit more affordable by working together more cooperatively. So starting to kind of inch into that sort of more food justice territory. But yeah, programs like food skills and, you know, community gardens and the like, I wouldn't classify as food justice work unless they're actually addressing the equity issue, or race issue, or oppression issues. A lot of work still to do.
I had more of a question, but the last couple of days we've been talking a lot about how when we're doing these types of actions or work to, like, you know, restore, sometimes for the first time, introduce equity or stuff like that, how we need to have like a constructive vision of what we want to work towards in the first place, like, so that we can actually, you know, have blueprints for what we're building towards and not act without thinking about where we're going and maybe reifying some of the same hierarchies and problems that we're trying to solve in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering what maybe you had, if you guys had conceptions, or if maybe other of other movements that have conceptions of what like an anti-capitalist like system of food production, of global food production that manages to feed 8 billion people actually looks like. Or like what it, you know, some theories of what it could be.
So like nothing big, just fix the things.
At least theories of what, you know,
Fix everything.
where we could go, yeah, that are concrete and not just like
Alternative
reifying the
system,
same
feed
thing.
everyone.
Or really
Yeah.
romantic,
Yeah.
emphasized, the local farm.
I think I can I'll speak to an example, and then I'll speak a little bit on the theoretical realm. One area I think that's quite promising is a group called La Via Campesina. And so they're an international food sovereignty group founded out of Latinx struggles in South America. A lot of like the fight is still alive down there, which is lovely to see. We wish we could bring some of that up to North America. But they've been doing, I think, a lot of the, can I say epistemological? Like ways of thinking, ways of knowing, way of doing work around what an anti-capitalist system could look like around food. So they're fundamentally anti-capitalist. They've explicitly stated that. And they work at a peasant organizing level, so landless peasants are their organizing root, and their strategy has been both place-based and international. So they work at 2 scales simultaneously with a high degree of autonomy, a very decentralized model. So like tons of people have studied the movement. Tons of people are pointing out where the movement has failed, and these are good lessons. Like, for example, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Ecuador internalized food sovereignty into their national level of policy discourse, which was like this huge flop. Basically, they just co-opted the entire thing, made it capitalist, and said, "We're food sovereignty, yay!" Which was beautiful, except the organizers who had been spending years working with the Ecuadorian national government were like, "This is not what we wanted at all." So that's part of the reason I think to work at an international audience and to pick those strategies appropriately. That being said, I think something that kind of is like still bugging me, and I don't have this fully formed out or articulated at this point, but like as I mentioned, some of the thinkers that I draw on, like Mou Francière, is this like fundamental notion of difference. And so I don't think that we actually like bridge and create commonality until we've acknowledged difference. And so like when we jump straight to this like imposed idea of sameness or homogeneity, I think that's a false construct, because nature abhors sameness. At least my understanding of ecology is that nature does not enjoy sameness. So why do we conceptually move ourselves in that direction? And so I think the fundamental question is, how do we organize across difference without subsuming difference to the power relations that hold at this current time? And so that's like the deep question. I think like, yes, we can get to a point where we can have temporary consensus, but to have the assumption being that we should and must get to consensus is a little bit iffy for me. Does that weirdly...
Yeah, I'm just curious about yours and anyone else's thoughts.
Yeah,
on
I'm
that,
interested
on
too.
the
Like
theory,
folks have
yeah.
been thinking a lot about this. I'm mostly thinking like where I'm getting to is like what's an ideology of the left. and like reinvigorating those kind of discussions, considering how good the right has been and creating a pretty like articulate, consistent message. So it's like part of the struggle, I think, for us collectively is like creating that ideology and being able to communicate it out like easily.
Were we just talking about that this morning?
Yep.
Right on message.
I should have been here this morning, but
No, that's not what I'm saying. It ties in, it just ties in perfectly. Yeah.
There's an organization in the States, you guys, some of you may well know this group, you know, Growing Power, and Will's daughter, forget her name, started a group. Anyone familiar?
What is it?
Food justice,
You're
food
what?
justice.
From Milwaukee.
You're from Milwaukee.
yeah.
Do you know the food justice and organizing group? Will's daughter is running.
I don't even know he had a daughter who did that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Far
so
out.
I-
Growing Power is awesome.
yeah, so well, Will, if none of you know Will, is African American dude that used to play professional basketball, started this amazing farm. But a lot of their work and a lot of the work of his daughter is focusing on anti-racism. It's all grounded in anti-racism, and so they're working with Latino, Black, other communities of color, really supporting these communities and getting into farming. They're looking at exchange systems, access to land, equitable access to land, and these fundamental sort of equity issues, but all through the lens of all through an anti-racist lens. And yeah, I'm just really impressed by the kind of work they're doing and building this community, this mutual aid, where there's right livelihood work that's being paid at fair wages and focusing on people of color's sort of entrance into food systems that really work. Yeah, so I look to them as a beautiful model. And then, in terms of Indigenous food systems, moving away from a productionist to that more regenerative, whether it can feed billions, but it's certainly a lot healthier system, for sure. And
Bianca Bachman did an internship at Growing Power all years ago. We have a social ecology friend in common and did some work with Growing Power and now
Yeah.
does food justice stuff in Brooklyn.
nice.
have you worked with Will? Have you met him? And
Never met him, but I just love their project. It's all urban. They don't have a farm like out
Right.
in the
Yeah.
boonies. It's right in downtown, in the economically hardest hit part of the north side of Milwaukee.
Yeah.
It's an amazing project.
yeah.
I guess just further to what you're saying about whether those regenerative practices can feed billions, I mean, this is a major justification for the global food system we have right now. I think Issa was sort of getting at this, right? Is that that's what's being used as the justification for the current conventional system as well. If we, transition to completely organic agriculture or whatever, we'll never be able to feed the global population. So,
I mean, it really depends on whose data you're drawing on there.
well, yeah.
The data is pretty mixed. We don't have a production problem though. So let's lay that myth to rest right now. So it's not a production problem, it's a distribution problem. And so the world currently produces enough, if we go by I'm not super satisfied with the health metrics, but we'll just say that the health metrics are there. But there's enough calories out there currently being produced to feed the world at this population and I think a couple more billion.
Yeah.
So
Like 1/3
major
more.
problems in distribution, major inequities in north-south relations, in the bodies and usually bodies of color producing food for the global north. Which is why La Via Campesina has been so powerful, is because how do you work in a context where you're producing tons of food and people are starving, right? So
Yeah.
Countries like India, where you have these massive production systems, or Philippines, where all of this rice production just goes right out, right? And then you've got institutions that refuse to fund agroecological or organic models of production. So we're also very data and research poor, and I don't mean that in like a traditional institutional sense. I mean like even just like grassroots farmers like doing seed trials and like plant trials. Like it could be done. We just don't.
We just don't do it.
We don't do it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think like this goes back to my earlier point about expertise. Is like we keep assuming that like the experts who come from Western models of like traditional academia or professionalism are ones who can and should be talent.
Could it also, sorry,
Yeah.
but could also have to, like, I agree with that as well, but I was also thinking is maybe, like, capitalism benefits from the current model of food production, so it has no incentive to, like, invest in research and, like, alternatives or in, like, really evaluating the metrics of the current system at all, because as long as it persists, like, the capitalists are happy with, you know, how it currently is. So I'm wondering, like, how I like the idea of like small scale like farmer seeds like testing and stuff like that. Like, how could that be like stimulated or like I don't know, kicked off the ground to see like global sort of maybe small scale, more decentralized, like to gather this data, you know, for ourselves if like the larger institutions aren't going to be doing it.
Well, we're doing that here at the farm. Like we're doing seed trials, for example. So we're part of a network of farms across the province. So it's not that huge, but it's still not just here, it's across the province, where we're trialing different organic seeds that different producers or growers, I'm gonna stop using that word, growers have grown or provided. So they've grown their own seed, grown their own plants, saved the seeds, and then now we're sort of testing them along with other farms in collaboration and just kind of growing them out. It's down, I forget where it is now, everything moves around. But anyway, the last few years we've been doing that. So we did leeks one year, beets one year, kale I think one year, and we're just sharing our data with the other farms of like which seeds grow the best, taste the best, have the best nutrients. Like so we have the university has all of the facilities to do the nutrient testing as well, and so getting all this information, and then we're sharing that out with other organic farmers and saying, okay, these are the strains that have done really well, please produce more, and then try to sell them out more. So we are doing that on a, you know, it's still a relatively small scale, but it's starting.
Do you think it would be possible, or is I don't know about intellectual property and seeds and stuff, and
No, it's all open source.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask if it's
yeah.
possible to make like an open source website
Yeah.
for global like data sharing like
That's
that.
the other thing, that's one of the key elements of it is it can't be like trademark, copyright, genes, seed markers,
Yeah.
or whatever, all that, no, it's like, it's all open source. Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
You know where my head goes is our government just bought a pipeline. You guys all know that,
Yes.
$4.5 billion, and then they're saying the actual cost that they actually build the thing will be $12 billion or more. And I'm thinking, okay, you know, like, so how do we, you know, I mean, then you're back to government, you know, government responsibility or government support for the system. You know, there's a lot of money around that could be redirected into, you know,
Almost
studying
anything
something
else.
Yeah, almost
Just
anything
about.
else.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you guys have the answer. I mean, organizing and what that might look like in terms of, you know, motivating governments to support more of this kind of research, looking at, you know, local food production that's cost effective, that's equitable and affordable for people. We haven't done that yet. We know that local agriculture and high kind of, I don't want to use the word productivity, it's a bad word in a lot of our circles, can produce a lot of food. Although up here in the north, you know, it's harder to grow in the winters. Highly dependent on Californian food for our food here. There's a lot of land in the city. There's a lot of land that could be used for growing food. We could feed a lot more people, I think.
You mentioned distribution as being part of the problem. I think I've read something like 40% of all the food that's produced, and I'm saying produced because it is through industrial production, ends up being thrown away.
Waste.
Is that a result of these extended distribution chains, food rotting on its way to market, et cetera, et cetera? It's not just, oh, I didn't clean my plate tonight, and I'm
Yeah, no, I mean,
going in the
I think it's that too, I think it's both.
I would say the individual residential contribution is there. It's not not insignificant, but you have a lot of like loss from fields. You have a lot that don't meet market grade. Those tend to be like bigger, and then you have some like through the processing distribution channels themselves, again lost at retail, so things just expiring off the shelf. But I think what's more problematic is just like our response to all of that is just like it immediately gets categorized as waste. So it's like field waste, it's like grid doesn't hit it, waste, on the distribution center, waste, and then at the market end, waste, and then at the house end, again, waste. So like folks who have read Cradle to Cradle, reconceiving of those streams as being non-linear, but seeing them as like circular, right? So at each point in a food system, which I still don't like as a term, like having those cyclical processes embedded, either at like localized scales or global scales.
So stuff like
Gleaning, processing, right? Like connecting community kitchens with farmers and a set of volunteers. And fundamentally for me, I think like we're missing this organizing piece. Right? So I do a lot of like work at the university with students. Our students are not getting skilled in organizing. That's like the very low on the skills and knowledges that we're enabling our learners as they come out of a university setting. Like they can research, they can write a paper.
Are you talking about it like across the board or in a particular food?
And can you talk about GMO? Some friends back in Britannia, Washington, undergraduate students want to form a food co-op for students to have food since we don't have any food court or anything. Do you have some advice to that?
Sure.
So seeds from Monsanto, GMO, and setting up a food co-op? Oh my gosh, okay.
Okay. Want to jump in anywhere?
I don't know the stats on how many seeds Monsanto controls. I know it's big, but I don't know. I don't have the stats on that. Someone could Google it, I'm sure.
Oh, follow-up question.
Wasn't enough.
You didn't really answer that.
Can you, or do you have information of how to get seeds that are guaranteed not coming from there?
From Monsanto?
Yeah.
Certified organic. Yeah, if you buy certified organic seeds, then they will not be Monsanto. Or GMO.
I think we had two. Did you guys want to jump in on this?
I think like on the co-op, oh sorry, go ahead.
Should I go?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay.
Are you answering Ilse's question?
Yeah,
You're
I'm
bringing up a new, okay.
jumping on that. So like I did some work with like a commune in Central Virginia last summer called Acorn, and they have a seed business, and they're like really concerned with like seed preservation because a lot of like seeds are being lost, like all of like the complexity is declining as like Monsanto is slowly like, you know, building their like power base or whatever, and like suing people for like finding seeds on their farm and shit, all this bad stuff. Yeah, and so like heirloom varieties are like, they like, I think that's even like a step above just like getting certified organic. But Acorn has cool seeds. They're trying to like preserve this like genetic diversity.
Do they sell them? Like out
Yeah.
into the world? Yeah, great.
I would also check out, this might exist in your region, if you Google like Seed Library, Washington or Seattle. Those are typically kind of like the same system as like a library. So like you borrow seeds, but the timeline is like you grow the seeds and then you put the seeds back in the library, right? So it's a little bit longer than the 28 days that you typically get, but the expectation is that you do something like that.
Because this is nearby to you, Olympia has this organization called Grub, which is Garden Raised Bounty. It's like a community-based, mostly like youth-oriented organization that does like farming and stuff like that. But they have like a free like seed program where you can just like anyone can go and they have like free seeds available. So
Yeah.
that's a resource you want to utilize.
Yeah.
You wanted to say something
Well,
about?
no, I was gonna introduce Maddie.
Oh, there
He
you go.
works in the food co-op.
Oh.
Yeah, and then Sherry, also is involved in the local cooperative movement. I live in a co-op, I shop and bank and drive a co-op car. So yeah, big proponents of cooperatives, and Sherry, you're organizing the Vancouver Cooperative Action Network, trying to get more, build awareness around co-ops. I think that there's a lot of potential to develop more food co-ops. Vancouver only has one co-op, the co-op Maddie works in. One small, very small co-op in the whole of Vancouver. You guys in Bellingham have a co-op that's 10 times bigger.
That surprises me.
Yeah, it's surprising, and then we have right across the street Choices, which is owned by one of the third, fourth wealthiest persons in Canada.
He's not passionate.
No, so they're
It's more competitive.
yeah. So Maddie, yeah, no,
Yes. So
East
the
End's
food
cool.
co-op, the East End Food Co-op is potentially about to close.
Financial reasons?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
this market across the street is just undercutting them.
Yeah.
I think Central Co-op is a branch in Tacoma. Am I wrong? Central
TCC?
Co-op is Seattle.
Yeah, you wanna form one for the schools.
For students.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they may have to build one.
Yeah,
Kelly?
I would maybe take a stab at the GMO issue, which is, of course, a huge debate. I think it's really relevant to social ecology. Yeah, so to me, the debate has been framed in terms of science versus anti-science, which I think serves industry for the time being. There's tons of disinformation on both sides. I see it more as an ethical issue of, human intervention in natural biological processes that should be free to, co-evolve ecologically rather than direct sort of dominant human intervention, which is sort of the process that's in place right now. So, I mean, that's sort of how I try and reframe that debate, but it's really hard to try and get that across to people so that they understand it, because there's so much muddying of the water, because there is a lot of like pseudoscience and bad science on the anti-GMO side. So
Yeah.
I'm wading into that debate on a fairly regular basis, and it's a challenge, it's a big challenge.
GMO is a huge umbrella term now. Like, there are lots of things that fall under, like there's lots of different activities and methodologies that fall under GMO now, and so, and you can, and there's varying levels of scientific rigor or analysis on those. So for me, GMO, something that's GMO is generally gonna be corporate controlled, and they'll have a patent on it. So I actually argue, that's the side of it that I disagree with. It's the capitalist side, because I feel like the other pieces are still,
Well, I think there's a fundamental ethical issue too, which I think social ecology addresses really well. Like, if you take a social ecological framework, you can really, start to dig into that.
And that's what we've tried to do over the years. I think I mentioned yesterday that the Institute actually organized the first and the largest anti-GMO demonstrations in North America, when they would have their annual meetings of the industry. We would hold the biodevastation protests and direct actions to try to call attention to what was going on. But the analysis was not so much a critique of the science as it was of the social ecology, which involves the ethical side, and also involves the fact that, it's centralizing power in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations, patenting the seeds. They're modifying the genes in a way that forces you to then buy more chemicals from them. They're driving small farmers out of business. They're displacing the great diversity of seeds. I mean, case in point, what happened in Mexico, where there were hundreds of varieties of corn that farmers have been growing for thousands of years, and suddenly 90% of the corn being produced in Mexico is Monsanto's GMO corn.
But pro-GMO people want to say that that is genetic modification, that like, selective breeding is the same as genetic modification. They just don't make any distinction between those two things. I think there's a huge distinction to be made.
There is, and I think, but it's true that, you know, the science it's unsettling, and for someone like me who doesn't have a scientific background, I have no real basis for critiquing the science. My wife has an uncle who was the head of the genetic engineering department at University of Chicago, and he developed a special potato for Archer Daniels Midland, and the specifications were to be sliced thinner than any other potato. You know, they paid him $1 million for it or something. I get in arguments with him, and I can't approach him at all on the scientific grounds, but he can't argue against me in terms of the critique that I offer, because it's indisputable.
Yeah, well, the ethical issue is huge.
But I want to touch on how corn actually was genetically evolved out of some like little poisonous plant that was selected over time to become
Through selective breeding.
Yeah,
Exactly.
It's genetic evolution rather than genetic modification.
That's the argument that I use, but on the pro-GMO side, they don't make a distinction. They say, oh, well, this is just, genetic modification is just the next step in that same process.
But there's interspecies introduction of genes from other species.
Yeah.
Fish genes.
But even if something has like a mutation, then they select the seeds from the one that has the mutation that makes it.
That's selective breeding, sure. People have been doing it forever.
But the argument is that it's a genetic continuum, so that they say it doesn't matter how you come up with
how far you jump on the
how you come up with the mutation, right?
You want to get some other voices here, Duncan? Do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, in the end, what matters is whose ox is for, who has, we're acting in our environment all the time in given social structures, real social structures, and in this case, a market-driven outcome that is going to, whatever your project's going to sink or swim by a corporation that pays for it. If we don't critique that immediately and initially, as well as act democratically and openly in our organizations, my first thing I did was I worked in the Great Boycott in 1969, which was the first huge consumer boycott in North America, and took in sort of ethical. It took on a huge corporation safely. It took on unions such as to develop a union and to counteract companies, and it was the first kind of real racial upswing for Hispanic people that I didn't as a kid. But tell you what, and in 5 years it won, and in 15 years, because the two issues I mentioned before were real.
Yeah, I mean, I think the GMO, GE foods, like Canada is a bit unique because we've technically classified everything as plant hybrids. So in our IP work, we don't even use GMO, GE, so we've managed to do some fun institutional haranguing in the way that we do things. But one thing that I'll point out is from the post-political work, and what I've been enjoying about the GE, GMO field is that what it really demonstrates is that democracy is now, or civil society moving against something, whether it's founded in actual science or not. We've seen successes, so in much of Europe, full-on bans of GMOs, full requirements of GE labeling on food products. We've seen the exact opposite happen here, same kind of demands for labeling, for identification of GE ingredients. We've had an entire nonprofit industry have to pop up to identify GMO foods for us, right? That non-GMO label. So that's a consortium of organic type industries saying, we want to position our products differently and consumers are asking for it. Whereas in Europe, they just said, well, the citizens are saying we don't want this, so we're just going to not do it. And every time the scientists come back and say, no, this is a definitional issue, this is a technical issue, the state should not be involved in scientific and making policy not based on sound science. Like, what are we, in the 19th century? Like, policy hasn't been made on sound science in years. Like, where is this belief coming from, right? So what I think is interesting about it is like this extraction of like certain discourses when they want to be employed, and then like the silencing of discourses when they don't want them to be employed. So like, that science, not good. Our science, good, right? And nobody is buying it. I think that's what's really exciting for me, just as it represents a continuing possibility for people to resist. Now, what's terrifying to me, though, is that the GE conversation has occupied the center of the range of, can I swear? Like,
Yes.
Food fuck-uppery that is going on in like everything we consume. So like, I have a lot of people when I was working, they come up to me, the question is always the same, like, Colin, what should I eat? Should I eat organic? Should I eat local? Should I become a vegan? Tell me what to do. As an expert, I of course lean right into that, right? And I usually say things like, I think the only thing I can say with certainty is don't eat processed foods. Like, just like as a catch-all, the only simplification I can offer to anyone, the overall socio-ecological ramifications, don't eat processed foods. So GE foods have popped on, they become this hot contest. Nobody is talking about food adulteration. No one is talking about things that we're adding that are supposedly inert to our food materials to add mouthfeel, right? Preservatives aren't coming under question. The range of chemicals that we use from production through to waste disposal, none of that has come under question. GE has kind of centered a very important food fight, but hasn't opened it to like really systematically challenge the food systems that we all rely on to say, it's not just the genetic engineering. There's a whole bunch of other shit going on that I think the powers that be are really happy to have the spotlight stay there, right?
Yeah, well, they want to have that debate because they think they can win it on the science too. They're like, oh, well, you people are just anti-science.
Yeah.
You know, the science is on our side. We can prove that it's safe.
Yeah.
Right? But that's why I'm saying, well, it's actually an ethical issue, and it's a much larger issue than they're addressing.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a moot issue at this point, right? If democratically people don't want genetically engineered foods, then if you're a democratic country, you should be abiding by that. There's no like, it seems very clear to me, but what I think is fascinating is that continuous rhetoric of like, the science, the science, the science, and they're like, we're just saying the same thing, we haven't had to do anything different, and now we're getting all this other stuff done over here. This is really great. So, yeah, that's like a big fear that I have right now in the food world.
Sherry, did you still want to jump in on this?
I'll take over, go ahead.
I was gonna shift things too.
Yeah, I was gonna shift back to the co-ops and organizing.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can we?
if you don't mind, just like jumping if you come up.
Ed?
I think it's better to go that way first. I'm gonna sit further.
And the other thing I was sort of reflecting on was, what's that, what were we talking about last night? Neighborhood federalism or neighborhood federations or something?
Neighborhood liberation.
Liberation
Front.
movement. That's right, neighborhood liberation front. So, yeah, I'd like to kind of maybe bring Ian's experience back sort of on the ground, back into the conversation. So, good segue.